You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 11th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Is Hamas's threat to keep its hostages a bluff? Do we yet understand what Donald Trump's Ukraine peace plan is and how beavers save the Czech taxpayer a seven-figure sum? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Olga Tokaryuk and John Everard will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Maurice Casey about his new book recalling the heyday of the Moscow hotel that housed Lennon's foreign fan club. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Olga Tokaryuk, Ukrainian journalist and fellow at Chatham House Leadership Academy, and John Everard, former British diplomat, UK ambassador to Belarus, Uruguay and North Korea. Hello to you both.
Hello there.
Hello.
John, first of all, you have arrived here as usual by bicycle, but not as usual straight from the operating table.
No, not straight from the operating table.
Oh, come on, I was trying to build you up over here.
Okay. No, I had heart surgery, 2 weeks ago now, a cardiac ablation. This is the second one I've had. It is incredible what they can do, keyhole surgery. I was only on the table for just over an hour and a half, and I was walking again within hours. I was on a bicycle again within 5 days. I made the mistake, because you actually have to walk up to the operating table. They used to wheel you. You just walk up now. We've gone very green in the NHS. And sort of lie down on it. It's a bit like mounting a scaffold. It's quite scary. And I made the mistake of asking the deputy anaesthetist what music his firm worked to. And he gave me a huge grin and said, "Oh, we like heavy metal. Bumpity, 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 bum." And he looked at me and said, "Slipknot." At that point, I just passed out and woke up again in recovery. But it seemed to have gone well.
So your heart surgery was undertaken to the strains of Slipknot?
Well, so he assured me. Actually, I was unconscious at the time, so I can't confirm this. But
it's absolutely the best state to be in while Slipknot is playing.
You know, I would entirely agree with that.
Olga, you are also talking this week about a new book, and though there have been many books inspired by or reflecting upon Ukraine's last 3 years of war, this one's quite a special one.
Yeah, so I'm going tomorrow to a presentation of this book, which is being released almost simultaneously in 6 countries, the US, UK, and several European countries of the continental Europe. And it's a book by Victoria Melina, who wasn't my close friend, but whom I have met here in London at London Book Fair in 2013, just a couple of months before she was killed by a Russian missile in the city of Kramatorsk in eastern Ukraine. So Victoria was a writer, but she was also a human rights activist, and she was documenting Russian war crimes before she became a victim of one of them. And this book, it has not been completed, so it's been like 60% finished when she was killed by Russia, and her editors managed to put it together. And this book also talks about other women whose lives have changed profoundly since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So it's a book about the war through the eyes of women.
And the title, just so our listeners can write it down?
Yes, it's called Looking at Women, Looking at War by Victoria Melina.
Well, we will start in Gaza, where the ceasefire agreement, which has held together maybe better than many were expecting, might now be on the verge of unravelling. Hamas has threatened to postpone a further release of hostages scheduled for this Saturday, claiming that Israel is not meeting its obligations under the terms of the deal, especially with reference to allowing humanitarian aid and emergency housing equipment into the Gaza Strip and allowing displaced Palestinians to return to the north of the Strip, however few of them do have homes to return to. US President Donald Trump, meanwhile, has demanded the release of all remaining hostages by midday Saturday under threat of, quote, all hell. John, what does Hamas appear to be playing at here, and are they in any position at the moment to dictate terms?
Yes, they're not quite to dictate terms, but their position is actually quite strong. Israeli public opinion has been horrified by the condition of the hostages that have been released. The movement to get them out almost at any cost appears to be growing, and Hamas, of course, still hold, we're not entirely sure, but several tens of hostages. Moreover, I mean, Hamas cannot afford to be seen to be weak in the face of what the Arab world regards as Israeli threats. It's not that they are calculating how far can we get away with, or what can we get away with. I think it's more that they are being forced into a corner. They have to make these strong statements. They have to play tough just to keep their own credibility.
I mean, is part of their thinking possibly, Olga, that if they don't release the hostages, it would reflect poorly on Israel and poorly on their new best friend Donald Trump were Israel to resume hostilities?
Yeah, it might be. It's difficult to kind of presume what the Hamas thinking is, but I think they understand that they are in an increasingly precarious position, also with Donald Trump backing Israel so vehemently and like much stronger than his predecessor. So I think like they are kind of trying to maneuver and see what kind of leverage they still have, and probably the hostages is the only leverage that is still remaining.
Well, on the subject of President Trump, he has been taking a keener interest than many expected in Gaza. He has recently been saying words on the subject again, a clip of which we do have.
Think of it as a real estate development for the future. It would be a beautiful piece of land.
Would the Palestinians have the right to return?
No, they wouldn't, because they're going to have much better housing, much better. In other words, I'm talking about building a permanent place for them, because if they have to return now, it'll be years before you could ever. It's not habitable.
John, again, it's always difficult to, I think, be sure of what Donald Trump is actually thinking, or even if Donald Trump is actually thinking at a given moment. The most charitable analysis of this, I think, is possibly that by deliberately saying out something outrageous, i.e. attempting to deport the entire population of the Gaza Strip and rebuild it as Fort Lauderdale, is he trying to bounce somebody else into taking charge of this?
It may be that that's what he's doing. If that is the case, one wonders who that somebody else might be. It's a pity we're having this conversation just a few hours before President Trump meets King Abdullah of Jordan, and we'll probably know a lot more after that conversation about what is really going to happen. But I think when President Trump first came out with this idea, to use a polite word, that people thought this was just him sounding off, it was crazy. But he's doubled down and doubled down. And I think we have to face the fact he might actually be serious about trying to move all the Palestinians. And he might be serious, too, about strong-arming the Jordanians and the Egyptians into taking them. I mean, this would fracture alliances in the region. It would probably end the Hashemite dynasty in Jordan. It would cause Sisi in Egypt no end of headaches. America would lose a lot of friends. But I'm not sure that Donald Trump is that worried about it. One thing that bugs me is that no Arab leader has yet come out and said, yes, absolutely, this is a wonderful idea. We agree. A big-hearted country ought to take these people. How about the United States of America? Home of the free, home of the brave. Give them all green cards and you solve the problem. But nobody's done that yet.
Just to follow that up, though, John, there is a serious question raised by that, which I think quite a lot of people who are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause have not wanted to address, which is, of the 2 million or so people who live in the Gaza Strip, I think it is a reasonable assumption that quite a lot of them will want to leave. Now, if they do want to go, they should be permitted to, shouldn't they?
Yes, absolutely. But it's one thing to say you're permitted to leave Gaza. It's quite another to say where you're actually going to go. And this is, of course, the nub of the problem. Round and round and round we go. Remember Shimon Peres's great peace plan that also fell apart because effectively he had no answer to what do we do with the Palestinians. The problem hasn't gone away. No peace in the Middle East is going to be permanent until some kind of solution is found to the plight of Palestinians. Perhaps President Trump can actually force Egypt and Jordan to take them, but that moves the problem rather than solving it. We're going to have Palestinians living in tents in one or both of those countries for a very long time to come, getting more and more angry and probably committing more and more terrorist acts.
I mean, Olga, one thing President Trump is unarguably right about, because it is just a statement of the obvious, is that there is a monumental rebuilding task awaiting in Gaza. Somebody is going to have to do it, if indeed it is going to be done. He's still insisting that the US will literally take ownership of this. I don't know whether he anticipates writing a cheque and buying this stretch of beachfront property, but Is there any realistic way that the US can do that without sending US troops to Gaza? And is there any imaginable way that US public opinion is going to be excited about that?
Well, it is remarkable, isn't it, how the rhetoric about like expanding one's territory or taking over some other territory has become normalized since Trump took office, right? So Gaza is the third territory that he mentioned that the US is going to step in and take after Greenland and Canada and what else. So
Panama is on the list
and
as well,
Panama, yeah. So I can't even keep track of, all the territories that he wants to grab. And it's just like, it's really remarkable how in like less than a month, basically all international norms and international law and international order is not applicable anymore, and how the international institutions that had some meaning like the US or, the principle of inviolability of borders and sovereignty doesn't matter. So basically it's just the rule of the strongest. So I don't know how Trump is going, like what's his plan about Gaza, whether he's going to send troops there or just like money and build business and handle it as another enterprise, like a hotel enterprise or a resort enterprise. But I'm just thinking about the repercussions of all this on, the rest of the world. The governments across the world are watching this and they understand they are completely, there are like no checks and balances in system in place anymore. It's completely the framework, the legal framework that kept the world together since the Second World War is disintegrating before our eyes, and I think it will just have very profound impact everywhere across the world, regardless of how the situation with Gaza is going to proceed and Trump's plan about it.
Well, on that thought, this weekend in Germany, world leaders will gather for the first annual Munich Security Conference since the reinstallation of US President Donald Trump, who will not be attending but will be represented by Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Other attendees will be keen for some sense of clarity of what lies behind Trump's remarks on various foreign affairs issues since being inaugurated 3 weeks, which feels like 10 years ago. One, obviously, is Ukraine, where Trump's self-imposed deadline for ending the war, 24 hours, has already elapsed. Olga, I cannot begin to imagine what the last 3 weeks have been like for any of our Ukrainian listeners. Most recently, Trump's sort of offhand remark that Ukraine, I quote, may be Russian someday. I'm guessing that doesn't reassure you tremendously.
No, it absolutely doesn't. But, I didn't really have high expectations of him, unlike many Ukrainians. Andrew, I was surprised when I visited Ukraine during the Christmas holidays that many people, even in my family members, they were really hopeful that Trump is going to stop the war. That
just to pick that up, on what basis? I mean, is this just people who are understandably desperate for anything,
wishful thinking,
for any hope at all?
I believe it's just wishful thinking. So I don't really think there was like factual basis. And also, I think there were some hopes because Biden was predictable, right? His policy towards Ukraine was predictable. This incremental support, not really allowing Ukraine to win, but not allowing Russia, allowing Russia to lose, but not equipping Ukraine with tools to win the war. And whereas there was some expectation that with Trump, yes, he's unpredictable, but maybe, just maybe, he's gonna really deliver on his promise and stop the war somehow and be on Ukraine's side. Well, I always had my doubts about that, and I'm afraid I'm proving, right on this. Because regardless of what like Trump says and what he says is very cynical transactional approach to this. Give us your minerals, let's make a deal, we can't support you for free, and then we do not care what happens to you. And I think this remark on Ukraine may be Russian, but we still have to make this deal, we still have to get our money back. I hope it will be a wake-up call for many in Ukraine, kind of trying to look at Trump with, this inflated expectations, and maybe rethinking the approach, towards something more realistic and how to deal with Trump.
President Volodymyr Zelensky, John, is going to Munich. He will be meeting Vice President Vance, and among Vance's public remarks on this subject, of course, is his line that he doesn't care about Ukraine one way or the other. If you're thinking about this with your diplomat's hat on, if you were advising President Zelensky about how to win friends and influence people among the new US administration, what would you suggest?
Firstly, note that President Vance hasn't repeated that line for some time. I mean, it's something I suspect he rather regrets having said. He's generally a much more cautious man than President Trump. Not a high bar, I grant you, but he is. What advice would I give President Zelensky? I would say, remember that President Trump sees the world through the eyes of a real estate mogul. Forget international relations as you once knew them. He sits and looks at a map and thinks, Greenland, underpriced. That could be a good real estate deal. Canada, whoa, big bit there, probably going cheap. Panama, easy knockoff. Ukraine, he's thinking, Ukraine, lots and lots of nice minerals that we can go and exploit. Now, if you put Ukraine in Trump's mind as part of his real estate portfolio, if you insert US mining interests into Ukraine, so there's an American interest there he has to defend, then you flip the game. Then he all of a sudden becomes enthusiastic about protecting Ukraine. Not because Trump cares two hoots about the Ukrainian people, let's not get misty-eyed about this, but because you've declared an American zone of interest that has to be protected against other people, other real estate brokers like Big Vladimir in Moscow, who's having a difficult time right now, and of course later the Chinese.
Olga, we are approaching the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and that is obviously a remarkable story of resilience, courage, ingenuity on behalf of the Ukrainian people, who I think most observers didn't expect would be able to hold out for a week at the most. And nearly 3 years later, here Ukraine still is. But are you frustrated, and is there a general frustration among Ukrainians that this has been 3 wasted years by Europe? Because for all of that 3 years, Europe has known that it was at least an average chance that Donald Trump would be re-elected president and that Europe may have to deal with this by itself.
Yes, I am. And
that was a leading question.
and yeah, it was. But yes, I am. And I think, Europe has not woken up yet, even after Trump's election, even after, all the statements and all the actions that have been made in this initial 3 weeks of his presidency. Because I've just listened to Friedrich Merz, the leading candidate to become the next German chancellor at the elections later this month, interview to one of the British media, which I'm not going to make because maybe which they are your, I don't know, the competitors. And I was underwhelmed, on what he said about Ukraine. It seems that even compared to his previous statements earlier in the election campaign, he's not as kind of tough, and he's not as willing to support Ukraine as he initially, indicated. So he was talking that, there will be no German peacekeepers in Ukraine unless the situation is like very stable, very safe for the peacekeepers. And then, my question is, what's the point of the peacekeepers after the situation is very safe there? So they're actually there to ensure, the ceasefire and that it holds. He was also very vague on the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine, and he also refused to commit to Germany actually increasing its defense spending to meet the target of, 3%, which is now seen as something that, should be said, that 2% is not enough anymore. So I'm not sure, that there is that Europe is waking up. I think there is still a lot of wishful thinking also in Europe, and a lot of kind of unwillingness to see the real situation, and that the waning, U.S. support, and that ultimately the war in Ukraine creates huge issues for the European security. And the U.S. is making it clear that they want greater European participation, that they want, Europe to play a greater role. But I'm not seeing signs that Europe is prepared to do that.
Well, let's move along. And this week in Paris, various potentates have gathered in an attempt to formulate some rules and regulations to govern the incoming onslaught of AI. By way of dismal omen, boffins at the University of Amsterdam have released a report which does not reflect tremendously well on efforts to impose order upon the online realm as it already exists. In scientific confirmation of the obvious, they have noted that radical right populists are employing misinformation to destabilise the democracies they seek to subvert, and are doing so at a significantly greater clip than relatively centrist or leftish parties. John, is it immediately clear from the report why the misinformation that they have countered, and they did this by assessing the postings of actual politicians, why this is more attractive to right-wing populists than any other stripe of politics?
Not from the data on which the report is based, it's not clear, no. I mean, the data does show quite convincingly that right-wing politicians are much more prone to engage in misinformation than left and centre politicians. Why they do it? The report speculates that it's because their fighting ground, so to speak, is on cultural issues, which the report suggests are more prone to misinformation than the economic issues on which the left tends to focus and which you can rebuff by reference to figures in a way that you can't with rather more vague cultural issues. But it is a bit nebulous. I think the report probably had discovered something quite important, but nobody yet really understands why it is that the right behaves in this way, in a way that other political sectors don't.
I mean, Olga, this is very much in your area of interest and expertise. Did anything in this report leap out at you as especially significant or surprising?
I just noticed what was missing from it, and what was missing, I think, is that some foreign state actors, which have been named here today, are very interested in, peddling disinformation, are using it as a weapon of war, basically. And of course, I mean Russia by that. And we also know that Russia is investing heavily in far-right movements across Europe and not just in Europe. So, I would also question kind of the how much of that misinformation, disinformation that far-right politicians or far-right actors are peddling, how much of that is genuine and organic and just, they came up with it, or how much of that is actually financed or supported by hostile foreign actors.
John, there's always the point with misinformation, though, that it only works if there are people willing to believe it. If you launch a misinformation campaign and no one pays attention, it's the tree falling in the woods, possibly. Actually, on further reflection, I'm not sure that analogy holds, but you know what I'm saying. I think. I do often think at moments like this of something that was said during a magazine debate, I think, by a regular Monocle Radio guest, the American pundit Tom Nichols, who likened this kind of thing to fast food. Like, I don't think he thinks that voters literally believe any of this stuff. They just enjoy it in the same way that they don't think going to name your own well-known fast food franchise is good for them, but they're enjoying it. It's fun, so they're going to keep doing it.
Yes, I think that's quite a useful analysis. There's another way of approaching this too. The way that political trends and media trends tend to balloon and then contract. Social media, I mean, it's been around for a while, but it is actually still relatively new, and it's still to an extent expanding its reach, but it's becoming polluted, it's becoming discredited. And I think over probably quite a short period of time, we'll see a balloon burst here, that there will be people, particularly on the far right, who will tune in to right-wing channels, both on television and on general social media, and believe them as a tribal commitment rather because they need to believe anything. But I think that the power of the channels to influence the core central voters will diminish quite sharply, and that it will become more like a cult than a political movement.
Well, one can only hope so. But in the meantime, Olga, the eternal question is raised about what do you do about it? And I think we all know the dynamics at the moment and what the dynamics of this proposition, and how reality is always at a disadvantage because reality is complicated and messy and nuanced. And of course, by the time you've actually managed to explain that to everybody, then what they chose to believe has already lodged in their minds. The question being, how do you win back voters who have become so detached from reality? And these people are out there in their tens of millions that they will believe, to borrow the US context alone, that USAID spent $50 million of their money sending condoms to Hamas, or that Haitians were eating people's cats in Ohio.
Yeah, well, it's $1 million question, and I don't have an answer. I think the tech platform's responsibility here is really huge, and we've seen all the narratives that you just mentioned being peddled on some platforms, completely uncontrolled. You can go ahead and say it. Yeah, with Elon Musk just retweeting completely fabricated stories, like the one about the USAID paying celebrities to go to Ukraine, which was created by, first appeared on Russian Telegram channels. So apparently, very likely created by people on the orders of FSB, Russian Secret Services. And then, it is being laundered by influential people such as Elon Musk, by the richest man in the world, on the platform that belongs to him. So, on instances like that, I'm kind of... I keep wondering, how did we allow this to happen? How did we allow this rich and influential people, these platforms, to have so much influence over us? And how it is that they face no accountability and that there is no mechanism, even, in the international documents, in international law, as much as that concept is becoming obsolete very rapidly, to take people accountable for that and to take platforms accountable for that, because it's a threat to national security, it's a threat to democracies. We've known that for a very long time, but we still don't know how to deal with it, how to counter it.
Well, at the very real risk of giving US President Elon Musk ideas, as he and his acolytes continue to astonish themselves and their online cult by learning that governments spend money on things, the government of the Czech Republic has apparently saved itself and its taxpayers in the vicinity of £1 million by outsourcing one project to beavers. A dam project, it says here, necessary to a rewilding initiative, stalled for 8 years by bureaucracy, has been completed in 48 hours by a detachment of 8 of the large-toothed semi-aquatic rodents. Pause for listeners to go, oh, okay, that'll do. It probably is the case that there are few other government roles beavers could take over, John, unless you are aware of any, given your experience.
No, I think beavers are probably better sort of stick to the dam building that they do so wonderfully well. Obviously, it raises all kinds of questions. If you're going to use beavers to build your dam, are they in the Czech Republic? Are they able to benefit from the European Working Time Directive? Do they have sick pay? Do they have paternity pay? And so on and so forth. But, of course, it raises questions like, could we actually find an animal that would, I don't know, fill in potholes, for example, pick up litter? Do we really...
goats will eat anything.
Absolutely, yes. Is there a wider role for goats in our society? I'm a great goat fan myself.
I'm a big goat fan.
Yeah. And if you also sort of look at it from the other end, we humans, I think we tend to do ourselves down. We look at beavers and think how clever they are. And we look at goats and think, yeah, wonderful creatures. Let them loose on the wrist of the hip and they'll clear it. But how do you think we look to pigeons, for example? I reckon pigeons have conversations among themselves saying, these biped creatures, they're really, really good. Look, they don't just sit around cooing all the time. They get on, they build big buildings so we can have roosts, and they feed us. Let's hear from the bipeds.
See, this is a difficult topic for me to invest in fully as an Australian, Olga, because while we do have a great deal of wildlife, we basically, most of our thinking around it is devoted to how do we protect ourselves from it rather than what can we get the wildlife to build for it. Are there Ukrainian equivalents? Obviously, other than uses in agriculture, has Ukraine found, perhaps in its recent experiences, ways to employ animals to help defend the homeland?
Well, the only thing I can think of on top of my head are, all the cute cats and dogs that Ukrainian soldiers are keeping on the front line and taking photos with, and who are playing a really crucial role in maintaining their, morale and helping their mental health. And a lot also of, and it is remarkable how I see sometimes, Ukrainian soldiers posting on social media with requests for these animals to be rehomed because, it's becoming increasingly dangerous and they don't want, to keep those animals there. And they're looking for people somewhere in safer parts of Ukraine that would take care of them. So it's really kind of, I think also in those kind of life-threatening moments is when people realize and kind of feel it more strongly, the connection to nature and connection to animals, and how important is to have some sort of harmonious relationship with the nature, with the animals, for one's well-being and survival even.
Indeed so. But just finally on this, John, you mentioned there the possibility of a creature that could fix a pothole, which is obviously a common gripe among citizens vexed by local government inefficiency. Have you ever been one of those people who's been tempted or actually has just gone out and done it yourself?
What, me fix a pothole, Governor? No. I don't think you want to go near any pothole to fix, to be honest. But coming back to the question you asked Olga, don't forget it's been tried. Before the US perfected the nuclear weapons, there was a big plan to use fire-breathing bats to attack Tokyo. The idea was that they would roost in the wooden eaves of Tokyo houses and set them on fire. So animals in that role, it's not entirely crazy.
Just connect this with the previous topic. Russian propaganda has for a long time been accusing Ukraine of using combat mosquitoes that allegedly spread viruses and infect Russian soldiers with something and develop bioweapons. So I don't know if we are there yet, but definitely somebody is looking forward to using animals in this way as well.
Well, on that heart and indeed bat-warming note, John Everard and Olga Tokaryuk, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, while recent history shows us that Russia has not tired of throwing its weight around, its motives these days seem more atavistic than ideological. Listeners may make their own call, which is worse. Back when the Soviet Union, as it then traded, was trying to export a revolution, Moscow drew a small and eccentric but devoted crowd of foreign zealots, many of whom gathered at one address to conduct a sort of improvised soap opera as their dreams withered around them. Their lives are recalled in a new book by Maurice Casey, Hotel Lux, an intimate history of communism's forgotten radicals. I spoke to Maurice at Midori House earlier and began by asking him to introduce his setting, the Hotel Lux.
The Hotel Lux was a boutique establishment in central Moscow, established in the early 20th century. After the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks seized it and they turned it into what became known as the living quarters of the World Revolution. So it became the dormitory for visiting revolutionaries from across the world. But its name grew only more ironic as the years went on, and it really kind of sank into kind of a decrepit atmosphere. But everyone who lived there still found it a quite amazing place to be because of the fellow guests and their backgrounds.
Well, it is an extraordinary cast of characters, and it's an extraordinary cast of characters cooped up in strange circumstances which they can't quite leave. It does really have quite the makings of a sitcom if you were thinking about where you could take the idea next. But what was your first point of connection with the story? Which was the first one of the guests you latched onto?
This all began as my PhD thesis, which was on Irish women and international communism in the 20s and the 30s. And as part of that research, I discovered that there was one Irish woman who lived in this hotel, which is a very well-known hotel in the history of international communism. And her name was May O'Callaghan, and she lived in room number 5. So she was my entry point. I began researching May O'Callaghan's life and the life of other people who gathered in her room, which became a kind of literary salon in the hotel throughout the 1920s.
It is an extraordinary cast, and as you make clear, this is the building that impressionable young revolutionaries from all over the world come to when they want to be in on what they perceive as this glorious experiment which is being undertaken in the Soviet Union. But the Irish contingent in particular, did they perceive any kind of overlap with the Russian Revolution of 1917 and their attempted revolution of 1916?
Yes, absolutely. Many of the Irish people who passed through the hotel were directly linked to the Irish Revolution. Roddy Connolly spent some time in the hotel, and he was the son of James Connolly, the socialist executed in 1916. They did see it as kind of carrying on that mission and internationalising the Irish national liberation struggle. Another family whose history is focused on in my book is the O'Flaherty family, so Tom and Liam O'Flaherty. They were both born on Inishmore, one of the Aran Islands off the western coast of Ireland, and Tom spent some time in the hotel in 1926. Other national groups in the hotel perceive the Irish in ways that still resonate today. They were the good crack contingent within the hotel.
But in terms of assembling the stories of these people, how much material is there? There is quite a tale that you relate in the book about how you managed to find some first-person accounts of life in the Lux. Yes,
so I was very persistent. This book took me 7 years to research. It took me 7 years because I learned Russian. I went to the archives of the Soviet Communist Party in Moscow in 2018. And I also, to the extent of my abilities traced the living descendants of people who gathered in that one room in the Hotel Lux. And I was really fortunate to find one big cache of material in an attic in the Cotswolds, and then another huge set of amazing documents in a shed in northern Spain. So part of the book is an archival memoir of a kind of my detective story to hunt out these living descendants and to find this material squirreled away in boxes.
Did you get a sense, though, of what the attitude to the actual Russian revolutionaries was to this crew of eccentrics gathered in this one hotel in Moscow? Did they take them seriously as partners in a global revolution, or was it more along the lines of what Stalin might have dismissed as useful idiots?
I guess you can divide it into two real periods in the revolution. There's pre-Stalin's ascent and afterwards, and that changes very much the atmosphere in the hotel. In the 20s, you have a feeling that the revolution could spread internationally, and this cohort who were living in the hotel would be the translators for bringing that revolution home to their home countries. So one of the figures who I write about who lived in the hotel at this time was M.N. Roy, who went on to play a very important role in the Indian Congress Party. And so he was very widely respected in the 20s as someone who would be a mediator between the Soviet Revolution and the future Indian Revolution. This changes in the 1930s and into Stalin's ascent and the move towards the idea of socialism in one country, and that socialism had to be defended within the borders of the Soviet Union, and also the rise of a xenophobic streak in Stalinism and its suspicion of outside contamination, which this hotel then comes to be seen as a hotbed of foreign revolutionaries who were suspected of being spies. And you see this atmosphere shift dramatically in the hotel, particularly as it comes to the terror of the 1930s, where the kind of freewheeling party atmosphere of the 1920s is an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia. And indeed, the arrests of 1937 onwards sweep through the hotel quite dramatically.
In later life, those that made it back from Moscow, did you find any evidence that they had, I guess, reflected on what might have been at best a period of youthful folly and regretted their participation in it, or did they by and large remain true believers?
My book traces the afterlives of those who I really focused on, and it's really the case of each individual had their own separate journey. With reflecting on that time and the friendships they made. One of the figures that I focus on, Joseph Freeman, he had a really remarkable life journey. He was born in Poltava in Ukraine into a Jewish family. He left at the age of around 7 and grew up in New York. And so for him, when he went to Moscow at around the age of 28, that for him was a journey of ancestral return. And he saw it as a vindication that someone who came from a Jewish family and who was pushed out could then return to the vaulted centres of power in the 1920s. But he himself had his own journey with the Communist Party. He left in 1939, the US Communist Party, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and then pieced together what it became of so many of his friends who stayed on, and so many of whom were executed and arrested in the 1930s. And so he spent the last decades of his life typing up reflections on that time in his New York apartment. And he came to a position which was not uncommon of having left the party but not wanting to publicly denounce his belief, because he remembered so many sincere idealists from his time in the 1920s, and he didn't want to betray them by publicly coming out against the cause. So really what my own interest in is these long afterlives of the time in the hotel. And I trace some remarkable legacies, some friendships that in doctrinal terms don't make sense. Stalinists being friendly with Trotskyists, even romantically involved, but do make sense when you realize that these people were together at a time which for them was, this was their undergraduate, if you like. This was their youth. And this is what bound them together.
That was Maurice Casey speaking to me earlier. His book, Hotel Lux, An Intimate History of Communism's Forgotten Radicals, is available now and very much recommended. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Olga Tokaryuk and John Everard. Today's show was produced by Monica Lillis and researched by Maisie Ringer. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.